the president is very dismayed with American allies. He's putting a lot of pressure on them. He wants help from them when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran essentially has at a standstill to oil traffic going through there. Oil traffic that doesn't really pertain to the U.S., but it does because that's how oil is priced. It's a global pricing system, obviously, and it's affecting the U.S. But he's frustrated with American allies.
Numerous countries have told me they're on the way. Some are very enthusiastic about it, and some aren't. Some are countries that we've helped for many, many years. We've protected them from horrible outside sources, and they weren't that enthusiastic. I just want the fake news media and everybody else to remember that that was said because I've been a big critic of all of the protecting of countries because I know that we'll protect them. And if we ever needed help, they won't be there for us.
All right. Our reporters are at the White House, Tel Aviv, and New York. They've been listening to the president's remarks. They're covering all different angles of this. I want to bring in CNN's Elena Treen first at the White House. Elena, what stood out to you based on what we heard there?
Yeah, I think really touching on exactly what you just played from the president was really the most notable to me, this idea of his disappointment. And he used that word specifically, Omar and Brianna, to describe the countries, and particularly the NATO allies, that he says are not coming to the United States aid here and trying to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. I thought, what we heard of him actually yesterday is very much the same kind of threat we're hearing today. Almost this ominous warning to countries who do not get involved here to send warships to escort these tankers, which is very dangerous, I should point out. We've heard that now from many top military, commanders and whatnot. But this dangerous, helping in this dangerous mission of trying to send these warships to escort these tankers through that very critical Strait of Hormuz. At one point, he said, I think we're going to have some very good help, and I think we're going to be disappointed with some countries, again, getting back to that point. But one thing that very much was clear, and it was a bit clear from that clip you played, is that he continued to talk about this idea of how he's always thought of the NATO alliance almost as being more beneficial for other members than it is for the United States. At one point, he said, I've said for years that why aren't we being reimbursed for what the United States is doing in the Strait of Hormuz? He kept saying, I've been saying that for years. He brought up this point that he believes that when these countries need help from the U.S. is willing to help them, not necessarily the other way around. One thing I do want to be clear on, though, and just some context to all of this, is what has been so interesting about the president calling on these countries to send these warships to help reopen the strait is that this is the first time, really, that we've heard the president be so eager to involve other countries in this war. I'd remind you that when the U.S. first struck Iran, of course, with Israel as well, a lot of these countries said that they were surprised and that they, were kind of caught off guard when that first happened. So I'd keep that in mind here as well. But really, I think this enormous pressure we have seen from President Trump, and I should note as well, someone who has repeatedly mused openly about this idea of withdrawing support from the NATO alliance, this pressure that continues to build. Even so, we still haven't seen a lot of these allies who the president said he wouldn't name, but a lot of these allies come out and say that they would actually send warships. You look at Germany, the UK, Japan, who I should note whose prime minister will be here later at the White House later this week. All of them so far being very cautious about heeding the president's urges here right now.
Members of NATO are responding after President Trump warned that the alliance would face a, quote, very bad future if it doesn't help secure the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the EU's foreign policy chief appeared to agree with President Trump that it is in Europe's interest to keep the strait open, but also added it's, quote, out of NATO's area of action. And a spokesperson for German Chancellor Friedrich Merz struck a more defiant tone, saying it is not NATO's war. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer spoke about the situation earlier.
We have to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to ensure stability in the market. That is not a simple task. So we're working with all of our allies, including our European partners, to bring together a viable collective plan that can restore freedom of navigation in the region as quickly as possible and ease the economic impacts.
Let's talk about the dynamics here. I want to bring in Jim Townsend. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for European and NATO policy. Good to see you. I just want to start on, I want to pick up with a little bit of what we heard from the president here in terms of the United States' relationship with NATO. On one hand, asking for help, not just from NATO countries, but from those from the likes of China and Japan as well, but also in the same breath saying the United States doesn't need NATO. And I just wonder, from the European perspective, where is the threshold for actual assistance here, and what do you think it would take to actually get to that point?
Well, it's a great question, and I think there's a lot of confusion about NATO versus NATO allies. But NATO as an institution, if it wanted to go to the Straits, if this was something that NATO agreed, like going to Afghanistan was, NATO could do that. But NATO right now would not have it would never get the votes within the alliance to make this an alliance operation. However, NATO nations can certainly come together in a coalition of the willing and go in there and do what the Prime Minister Starmer was talking about, to go in there and to work with the U.S. Navy and get the straits open. So as far as Europeans are concerned, they realize that this is going to be in their interest because of the price of energy and other economic ramifications. But they're still stung by how they have been addressed by Trump and how the alliance has been addressed in terms of NATO. So there's not a lot of good feelings towards the United States right now, particularly because they were not part of the process in the run-up to this war.
And that's one of the major contrasts here, that in the past we may have seen the United States sort of feel out that support that may be there from allies before taking action as significant as we've seen here. Obviously that didn't happen here. But in terms of assistance, the president is asking for whatever it takes, to quote him, including minesweepers, for example. What help could NATO countries actually offer here that would help in the United States efforts?
Well, one thing that a lot of the NATO nations who are seafaring nations, like Denmark, UK, and others, they do minesweeping. NATO has a very capable minesweeping capability among the nations. So it doesn't have to be a NATO maritime operation there. It can be the nations themselves who can bring their minesweeping capability to the Gulf. The UK used to have minesweepers there. They're not there anymore. The US did too, and they're not there. So I think what's important here is that that the allies, the NATO nations themselves, that this might not be a NATO operation, but the European nations know that this has got to be done. And I think they need to hold their nose and get this done. Trump or not Trump, a German war or not a German war, a NATO war or not a NATO war, we got to put that aside. And these nations can bring not just their minesweeping, but they've got frigates, they can do escorting, they can do a lot of things, leaving the combat activities to the U.S. if that's the way they want to do it.
We're joined now by CNN military analyst, retired Army Lieutenant General Mark Schwartz. General, thank you so much for being with us here. And in response to Trump's calls to assist with keeping shipping lanes open, there was a spokesperson for the German chancellor who said, this war has nothing to do with NATO. It is not NATO's war. So, maybe you can sort of dissect the president's request here. I think there's a lot of folks who look at it and think there are flaws, but also, can NATO really wash their hands of this?
I don't think they can. I think NATO collectively as an alliance, maybe it's not a NATO alliance Article 5 scenario, but certainly there's many European countries that have provided littoral combat ship-like vessels, frigates, other countermine capabilities to many of U.S.-led coalition maritime efforts. So I suspect we'll see several countries eventually agree to come in. The United Kingdom is, you heard the Prime Minister speak earlier about, hey, let's come together and put together a task force, a coalition to support freedom of navigation. So, I wish this wasn't playing out in public. It's not healthy, I don't think, with long-standing alliances, the kind of, tit for tat that's going on. But I do think inevitably we'll see many European countries come to support this effort.